Hello, hello. All right, we're back. We are now going to cover the rest of chapter 5, which I'm calling chapter 5B, which is we talked about Shakespeare, we talked about the English Renaissance, we talked about Hamlet, and now we're going to talk about what was happening in the rest of Europe. Okay. The Renaissance, the rest of the Renaissance, chapter 5B. All right, so when the Renaissance happened, remember, we didn't have theater for a long, long time. Then we kind of got back with some medieval theater, and then the Renaissance is where everything kind of bloomed. And in Italy, they drew from the old Greek and Roman theater. So they wanted things to be a lot like what they were before. At first, these were performed in the ballrooms of nobility, but because they were not in a permanent theater, they wanted to make the performance space look more real. So they began to use perspective scenery. And this is really important that this takes place during the Renaissance. And this is the emergence of theater as we know it today, where they represented the actual places and the background scenery and changed the scenery for different locations. So prior to this, if you remember in Greek and Rome, they had the Scene and the Scene Franz behind them, but it was the same background for everything that they did. So they could be in a palace, they could be in the woods. You didn't know it was just the same background. Now they're going to start changing the background. So if we're in the woods, the background's going to look like the woods. And if they move and go into the palace, they're going to change the scenery and make it look like the palace. Perspective scenery means that you could see things in perspective. Things look like they were going further and further away. The further that when you draw things to a point and when you make things come out, it looks like they're getting closer. Make things bigger as they're closer and smaller to make them look far away. And so they started this in artwork, and of course, then it translated to scenery. There was a raked stage. So basically, a raked stage, what they did was it was like a slide. So if the actors moved back here, they were going, this is how it was towards the audience. So they were literally going up stage. And when they moved towards the audience, they were going downstage. And that's where we get those terms today. When they say downstage center, they mean go to the front of the stage towards the center. So it was built on a slant to kind of create some of that forced perspective. So upstage means back and downstage means front. And so this is what one might look like today. And people do still perform on raked stages. And yeah, they had to like make their scenery fit. So with this example over in the top left here, they had to make, one leg of the table shorter than the other leg so that it would sit flat. So it was really, they did a lot of illusion kind of things with scenery. The proscenium arch, this is a very important part of Renaissance and of perspective scenery. So you needed to have a picture frame for people to look in, otherwise the perspective wouldn't work. And it was actually best if they were sitting right in front of the stage. But they did like this frame around the stage to create this effect. And this is where we get the proscenium stage, the proscenium arch, where you want the audience to be on right in front of you and looking at you rather than on the sides. So anyhow, the audience didn't want to see around the scenery and it would destroy the illusions. So they wanted people to be able to see this forced perspective. Okay, now I'm going to share with you this short video that gives you a good idea of what perspective scenery looks like. They found this old theater in Germany that still has the old workings from the Renaissance time. So I'm going to go ahead and share that with you and hope that you can see that. That box is, it has rocks in it. It makes it sound like thunder. Okay, so that was Drottningholm Slottsstetter Theater. And you saw how the scenery changed and stuff. There were ropes, there were actual manpower, people changing and stuff like that. It's called the chariot and pole. They had slots in the floor, and places where, you know, everything moved just perfectly. Okay. Also in Italy, they had something called the intermezzi. So it was the interlude. And so these were actually performed between acts of a play. So you have a regular play going on and everything that's happening in there, and then kind of like in the, I think, intermezzi intermission. So in between when they were changing the scenery and stuff, these uh, things that usually didn't have anything to do with what the play was would come out and they would be little separate acts. But they ended up being spectacular. They were elaborate compliments that suggested parallels between some mythological figure and the person in whose honor the festival was being given. So if we are at the Duke of York's house celebrating the Duke of York, the intermezzi would have to do with like Hercules as, or the Duke of York as Hercules or something like that. They would have some sort of a parallel between somebody in mythology and whoever they were, you know, celebrating at the time. Each of them featured very, very elaborate special effects. You know, this is an old picture here, but you can see up at the top, these look like pyrotechnics coming out of the top of this thing and on the sides, and people up there, acrobats flying around. And this is, you know, the second intermedio, so it's an intermezzi. You know, it's someplace or whatever, but the special effects were elaborate. And like I said, they didn't have anything to do with the regular play. They were just in between the acts of the play. They took on a life of their own, and the people would come just to see the intermezzi. This was a quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica about what the intermezzi were. Machines capable of flying up to 50 characters, 50 people, may be used. Moving mechanical figures representing men, animals, and objects were cut out of pasteboard and drawn across a scene by invisible wires. So again, all sorts of really cool special effects, and that's what intermezzi is. And music and dance were usually major features in these intermezzi. Excuse me. All right, so where did you sit when you went to an opera house? Kind of, you know, Shakespeare kind of had this a little bit, except that he had that standing room only in the Globe Theater. But in an Italian opera house, this is kind of the seating that ended up being the standard throughout Europe. There was the pit, which is the lowest level. It's closest to the stage. You know, we still call that the orchestra. We call it the orchestra when we go to the Majestic, right? But it's the orchestra pit. And really, it got that name because there is an orchestra pit. There's a depression usually in front of the stage where the orchestra sits. But this was called the pit box and gallery seating. So the pit is your main level on the floor. The boxes up here in the corners, they were very private. And so perhaps nobility or people with a lot of money would sit in these boxes so that they weren't disturbed by the other people. And those were their special boxes. To me, I'm thinking you're off to the side, you can't really see as well, but they were closer to the stage. So there was that. And remember, there's no microphones back in these days. And then the gallery, that's up in the balcony. That's like what we would call the nosebleed section. Okay, so that's all the way up at the top. That's the gallery. That's where other people would sit who could maybe afford a little bit more and didn't want to sit in the pit. Okay, now we all want to sit in the pit. At the time, you had more money if you could afford to sit in the gallery. So the pit was kind of the lower class, the boxes were upper class, and the gallery was kind of middle class. So the box, pit, and gallery, it permitted each class of people to attend without having to mingle with the others. The boxes permitted well-to-do snobbish to be private in a crowded place. The pit was the ground floor. It was less expensive than the boxes, and it's mostly for those people who didn't care about their reputations. They could be seen with whoever, and they didn't really care. It wasn't a scandal for somebody to be seen with somebody else. And then the gallery, like I said, it's now called the nosebleeds or the balcony, were the least desirable, and they were the cheapest seats, usually by working class people, because, again, they were so far away from everything. Okay. English masks. So English masks are similar to the intermezzi. They did take place in England, and they were very similar to the intermezzi in that they were small shows that were self-contained. They were independent productions. They weren't performed at plays. So intermezzi, they were performed between the acts of another show, where the masks were standalone performances. But they were usually pretty short, and they usually were performed solely for the court. So the king would have the noblemen there, and they'd perform there, or they perform at one of the other palaces. And the subjects of them, they were taken primarily from classical mythology or legends. And again, like the intermezzi, they compared whoever was being honored or whoever was throwing the party to some hero in mythology. And they used music, dance, costume, scenery, and elaborate special effects. Again, very similar to the intermezzi. They just weren't in between acts of a show. Commedia dell'arte is a professional comedy troupe. Professional means that they are paid. So Commedia dell'arte means comedy of professional artists. And they could also be called Commedia al improviso, which basically means improvised comedy. They improvised everything. So they were professional actors, which means that they were paid. So, but they didn't perform only in a theater. As a matter of fact, they performed all over the place. They performed for common people, and they performed for the ruling class, the nobility. They performed for anybody who paid them. And they performed really anywhere and everywhere. They didn't have a special theater that they used, so their backdrops were very plain and simple when they did use them because they were traveling a lot. They were very adaptable. They could play inside, they could play outside. And that was one of their major assets. They were very adaptable and could perform anywhere. Commedia dell'arte, their scripts were not actually scripts. They were scenarios, scenes that kind of summarized the situation and the complications and the outcomes. So, for example, they might say, okay, we're going to do the bit where the old man wants to marry the young girl, and the young boy really wants to marry the young girl. And so the young boy is going to try to outwit the old man in order to get the young girl. And so they had these bits of sceneries. Okay, yeah, we've done that before. Okay, you be the old man, all right. Okay, and you are the lovers, and you were this, and you were that. And then they would just act it out. So the words that they used weren't the same each time because they were improvising, but they kind of knew where they were going with the story, and they had done it so many times. So they improvised their dialogue, they kind of fleshed out their characters as they were going. They had something called Lazi, which were comic bits of business, things that they would do. They were usually really funny. And Lazi, it was usually performed by the lazy servant, and it's actually where we get our word lazy from, was from this kind of stock character who was lazy all the time and didn't want to do these things and did really funny things. So there are three categories of characters in Commedia dell'arte. So we have the lovers, and so there's always a pair of lovers, young people, they don't wear masks. Okay? They are the ones that are young and in love and should probably end up being together. Um, then there are the masters. And these are usually like the father of the female lover, or maybe the father, two different fathers of the lovers. The lovers were usually young, and the masters were usually old. And the masters were all wealthy enough to have servants. So we have the servants. And the servants were the comic relief. They were really the funny part of this thing, these situations that would happen. Um, all the physical, humor and stuff was performed by the servants. So these are the three categories of stock characters: the lovers, the masters, and the servants. Okay, the lovers, there were several different lovers, but this one down in the middle of the front, her name was Isabella. I'm sorry, I got lost for a second. Isabella. And Isabella was played by a person named Isabella, and she did it so well for so long. People loved seeing her that they actually named the character after her. And so later on, people would play, okay, you be the Isabella character. So, but these are the lovers. And again, they don't wear masks. The masters did wear masks. And I used to had other pictures of it here, but I just have the one right now. There were three different types of masters. I believe there was a doctor, a captain, and I can't remember the other one, but I remember that there were those two. And the captain was kind of a braggart. He was one of those people that was always talking about all the things that he did, but then like a mouse comes across the stage and he screams and yells and he's a coward for real. So they all had very funny qualities about them. The three most used masters are Pantalone. So he is, where did it go? Oh, I thought I had pictures of him. So Pantalone is the elderly, oh, the merchant, that was the other one, the elderly Venetian merchant. And he had a brimless cap, a brown mask with a large hooked nose, and a scraggly gray beard. And everybody knew that that was Pantalone. Then there was Dottore, which was the lawyer or a doctor. So he was usually either a judge, kind of a lawyer, so somebody really high up, or a doctor. And they loved to show off with all these speeches filled with Latin, and often it was just ludicrously incorrect. So, he'd make up words and pretend that they were something big, and everybody knew that he was just making them up. And so it was very funny. And then there was Capitano. So he began as one of the lovers, but then changed into the braggart and the coward. So yeah, I fought all these wars or whatever. That kind of thing. All right. Then we get into the servants. And this one you might recognize as Harlequin. Arlecchino is the other names. Harlequin, Truffaldino, or Trevellino. Obviously, I don't speak Italian. And so he was a servant character. He was a zany character, which is origin of the word zany. And that means that he was just kind of crazy, right? And he carried a slapstick. And a slapstick was two pieces of wood that looked like one piece of wood, but there were actually two pieces together. I have a little fork and knife here to show you. And so If you hit somebody with one piece, it kind of makes a thud. But when you have the two together and you hit somebody or you hit something, it made a much louder sound. Or I can't even do it right. Rather than, okay. So it was a slapstick and it slapped together and it made a loud noise. And whenever the servant was bad, the master would try to, hit him with it, and like the master would slip and fall, and then the stick would hit the master instead. But again, they sounded really loud. And it's where we get our origin of slapstick comedy. So two club-like objects composed of wooden slats and produces a loud smacking noise when struck, though there's very little force behind it. So slapstick comedy. Slapstick comedy is anything that's like the big physical comedy, or the Three Stooges is a good example of slapstick comedy. I Love Lucy. And anything that's like physical comedy. So think Jim Carrey, right? Big, oopsie daisy, alrighty then, those kind of big movements and funny things and slip and falls and all that kind of stuff. So that's called slapstick comedy, and this is where we get that term for it. A troupe, a commedia troupe, actually consisted of about 10 to 12 members of all the different characters. And again, they only played themselves. They only played their one character. They didn't play their real person, but they played one character, and they got very good at their one character. They knew what their one character would do in any given situation, and that's why they were so good with the improv. Okay, a guy came along named Carlo Goldini. Okay, 1707 to 1793, and he is Italy's most famous comic dramatist, playwright. He wrote The Servant of Two Masters. Now, he believed that commedia dell'arte was a great type of theater to do, but that it really should have a script. It kind of defeats the purpose. So there were two schools of thought. One is we need to clean it up. We need to make it less vulgar, because when they can say anything, they might say anything. So he thought that some of the situations were really bad. So he decided he was going to clean it up. And so that's why he wrote this script, The Servant of Two Masters. He also believed that actors should not be allowed to improv, which was the whole point behind Commedia dell'arte. So he wrote these scripts for the characters in Commedia dell'arte. He also wanted to abandon the masks. He said that it hid the facial expressions of the actors, and it did, but usually they were only half masks, and they only came to here, and you could see the nose and mouth, and it did hide their expressions, but that made them have to be bigger, usually more comical, usually larger than life, which is why the lovers, the more serious of the actors, didn't have masks. But there was another man named Carlo Gozzi who bitterly opposed Carlo Goldini. Yes, they were both named Carlo, and their last names both start with G, so it's kind of confusing. But Goldini is the one that wanted to write everything down. Gozzi emphasized fairy tales and improvs, and he wrote scripts, but they were much looser, and there was a lot more improv in them, and so they were these two warring factions in Commedia dell'arte. And then about 1775, there was no more Commedia dell'arte. The art form just kind of dried up. People weren't doing it anymore. Now, since that time, people have revived it and still do it today. And if you go to Italy right now, you can see troupes doing it. But again, they are kind of trying to copy and replicate what happened in the Renaissance. They didn't evolve and keep going. They're the same kind of stories and stuff that they had then. And people are doing that to honor it and because they like it. But that particular genre just kind of died. All right. Then let's move over to Spain. So that was Italy, right? So Spain, because in Spain there was the Spanish Inquisition, So if you guys don't know what that is, you might want to look it up. But basically, the king and queen in Spain at the time decided that they didn't want anyone who wasn't Catholic in Spain. So if you were Jewish or if you were Muslim, you were like arrested or you were made to be a lower form of um, person. I think the Jewish people that were there kind of basically just kept quiet, and they were usually reduced to only being bankers, which is unfortunately the one of the jobs that they were very good at, but they could do. So the Jewish people have a reputation of being very good with money, and that was because that's kind of all they were allowed to do at one point. But um, remember, I told you how religious theater was banned. Okay, like it was against the law in England to actually do religious theater. Well, it was not banned in Spain. And as a result of not being banned, it flourished. And it looks a whole lot like the medieval theater did. They have these wagons that come out and they do auto sacramentales. So basically the sacraments, and they were associated with the Feast of Corpus Christi like they were in medieval times. And so they combined the mystery and the morality plays on the wagons, and anything was accepted. It didn't have to go in order of the Bible like it did in the Wakefield cycle. Anything was okay as long as it was religious. So originally, the trade guilds put them on just like they did in the medieval times. But by the late 1500s, the city council paid for everything, including professional actors, much like they did in Greece. So the city kind of took taxes, and with the taxes, they put on these plays. They were religious plays, and they thought they were good for the people. But they got paid for doing it, so they were professional, because that's what it means to be a professional. So the professional theater in Spain is directly linked to its religious drama and the Auto Sacramentales. Okay, now let's go over to France. And there's my good friend Cardinal Richelieu. So Cardinal Richelieu decided to make France the cultural center of Europe. He was tired of Italy really kind of, stole the thunder for a while. And he says, no, no, Italy and France have been at war forever, just like France and England. And so, he wanted to say, he said, no, 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 no. France must be the cultural center. And he was a cardinal, which is a clergy in the Catholic Church, but they had a lot of power. So there it goes like priest, then bishop, then archbishop, then cardinal, then pope. So he had a lot of clout as one of the cardinals. And he decided that he was going to, again, make France the cultural center of Europe. And he adopted the proscenium stage and the perspective scenery. So let's have the square, let's have all the perspective scenery. He reformed the French theater. And he came up with the neoclassical ideal. And this ideal was very, very strongly used and adhered to mostly by the people. Um, he said that a play could only be either comedy or tragedy. There was no mixing of the two, and there was nothing else. You could only have comedy and you could only have tragedy. And if it was tragedy, then it had to deal with noble people, royalty, and things like that. Because, the whole idea that Aristotle said about tragedy was it was somebody noble falling from grace. So he's trying to kind of make it classical, but it's the new classical, so neoclassical. And so tragedy can only ever be about royalties and nobles, and comedy can only ever be about common people and middle and lower classes. Okay? Characters should all behave in a manner appropriate to their social status, gender, and ethnicity. So we can't have women wearing pants or anything crazy like that. That wouldn't really happen in real life. They need to do what they're supposed to do. If your social status is that you're a servant, then you should act like a servant. Don't be taking on airs and talking back to the nobility or something like that without some sort of reprimand. So you need to stay in your lane, more or less. All plays must be written in 5 acts. Okay. And all plays need to assume the unities. The unities, the 3 unities are very important, and these will be on your test. Okay. The 3 unities are unity of time, unity of place, and unity of action. And the unity of time means from the time that the play starts till the time that the play ends, the actual time in the play cannot be longer than 24 hours. Ideally, it should take place in real time. So a minute of stage time should be a minute of time in the audience's life as well. So he didn't want anything. You couldn't start a play and then, have the lights go out and come back on and say 5 years later, or 2 weeks later, or 2 days later. Um, you could have it say 30 minutes later or an hour later because he was giving a little wiggle room. But basically, from the start of the play to the end of the play, all the events of the play had to take place within 24 hours. That's the unity of time. The unity of place means that it was all took place in the same location. You could move from inside to outside, but you couldn't go any further away than you could in real time. So if your play was taking place in a house and you wanted to go to the park, if you could actually walk to that park in, less than 24 hours and then walk home again, that was fine. But you couldn't have the play start in Paris and then, the next scene happen in Germany and then the next scene happen back in Paris again. It had to be in one location, in one spot. And if it moved within the location, it had to be someplace that would still keep intact the unity of time. The unity of action means that there should only be one plot. There shouldn't be a bunch of subplots. So in Hamlet, we had, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern showed up, and Claudius had them take, Hamlet over to England. And then, Hamlet left them there and came back. And it was kind of a device to get him away while, Ophelia killed herself. But still, that was kind of a subplot and sub things that were going on. None of that. We have one plot. We don't want to convolute it with any subplots. We keep everything so that it's orderly and people can understand it. So again, time, everything has to take place within 24 hours. Place, it had to take place in the same place. And action, there was only one plot. All plays should uphold poetic justice. Basically, you should punish the wicked and reward the good. We didn't want any plays like, again, tragedies could happen to nobility, but they should happen to nobility that have a flaw, right? Oedipus had a tragic flaw. His hubris was his tragic flaw. So he fell from greatness because basically he just wouldn't shut up. So, he had a tragic flaw, and we could all get behind that. But you don't want to hurt somebody who's weak or, meek. So only the wicked should be punished, and the good should always be rewarded. So we want poetic justice in all these plays. And the purpose of drama was to teach and to please. It wasn't just for entertainment, but it was also to instruct people, teach them how life should be and how everything should happen. Okay, Cardinal Richelieu, the neoclassical ideal. It's a big deal. All right, then let's talk about the Palais Royal. So the major French tragic playwrights, the tragedy, there were 2 of them. One was Pierre Corneille, and he wrote a very famous play called Les Cid. And the other one was Jean Racine, and he wrote a very famous play called Phaedra. And until around 1800, these tragedies were considered superior to Shakespeare's tragedies. As a matter of fact, when Shakespeare was popular, performing in his shows in England and stuff like that, he was not all that popular. He was popular among the English, but everybody else kind of, yeah, it was all right. Wasn't until much later they went, wow, these are really good. So, um, but until around 1800, these Pierre Corneille's The Cid and Jean Racine's Phaedra were considered superior tragedies. Our major comic playwright, you may have heard of him. His name is Moliere. His actual name is Jean Baptiste Poquelin, but he went by Moliere. That was his stage name. He wrote the plays, he was in the plays, and he ran the play troupe, kind of like what we think Shakespeare did as well. But he wrote a play called Tartuffe, which kind of got him in trouble. And if this were a longer class, I would have you guys read Tartuffe. But he performed in the Palace Royal, and it was at first owned by Cardinal Richelieu. He created this theater within the palace. Okay. And then after Cardinal Richelieu died, it was now owned by the king, but it was open to the public. So I want to go back for a second because I want to talk briefly about Tartuffe. I didn't make you guys read Tartuffe, but Tartuffe is the play that got Moliere in trouble. Tartuffe, the actual character Tartuffe, was a clergy person. Okay, so I don't know if he was a priest or someone in the clergy. He was someone in the church, and he befriended the owner of the house, Oberon, and he convinced Oberon that he was the most pious, the most wonderful person in the world. So it's very comic. You come in and the Oberon's saying, "Well, how is everything going?" And his mother says, "Oh, well, I, had, really bad, aches in my knees." And he's like, "That's nice." And he says, "And, well, what about Tartuffe?" "Oh, he seemed to be, fine and was walking and, walked around the block." "Oh, poor guy. I bet he got tired after that walk." So he just thinks he's wonderful. It ends up that Tartuffe tries to basically swindles him out of his house, swindles him, gets an agreement to marry his daughter who was already betrothed to somebody else, and is hitting on his wife. And Oberon doesn't believe any of this until the wife, there's a scene where the wife says, "Look, I'm going to show you. You come hide under this table and I'll try to get him to come on to me and you'll see that what a wicked guy he is." Well, he does, and he pretty much has her like almost splayed out on the table, and she's like giving all these hints like, "Okay, now would be a good time to come out," or whatever. And he finally comes out and she's like, finally, this guy was about to rape me on the table. Um, but it's actually pretty funny the way it all falls out. In the end, though, Tartuffe has swindled him out, and he says, "Fine, get out of my house now." And he says, "Well, actually, it's my house now because you signed the deed over to me, and your daughter is my wife, going to be my wife, and you have to get out." He's like, "What?" And so the whole play, though, ends that somebody in the palace realizes that Tartuffe is a bad guy, comes and arrests him and takes him away. It's kind of a deus ex machina. It's like, really? The king comes in and saves the day, and Oberon and his family get their house back and everything. Now, the reason that this was a horrible play and heresy at the time, especially according to Cardinal Richelieu, is that they made the bad guy part of the clergy. And they were worried that everybody was going to think that this hypocrite, that this was typical of the clergy. And, most people knew that it wasn't. It was just a funny play. But he was actually forbid to show it for a while. And then, came back and then got arrested because he performed it again and all sorts of other crazy things. But Tartuffe is a very funny play, and it's interesting because it really got him in trouble. All right. What are the differences between the English and the French theater? So English, England, if you remember when we saw that video about the Globe Theater, where Shakespeare was, there's a thrust stage. So there's an audience on three sides. And on the French stage, it's the proscenium. It's the box. We want everybody to look through the picture frame so they can see the scenery move and it look really cool. In English theater, there were no women actors. The boys played the female roles. And remember, they thought that the young boys played women's parts better than women could. Really? In French theater, though, women could act and they were treated as equals. In English theater, had to be performed during the daylight hours because they had the open roof theater. So the sunlight that came in, that was the only light that they had to do the show. But the French theater was performed inside because they had to have the proscenium theater. So they used chandeliers and footlights. They used candles and oil lamps to light the stage. The English theater, there was seating and standing were the groundlings, because remember they all stood around the thrust part of the stage. Then they had boxes for nobility, and then they had balcony. And the seating in Italy and in France were the same, where they had the box pit and gallery. But sometimes members were actually allowed to sit on stage. Like if the king came to the performance or some nobility, sometimes they'd let him sit on stage, which I think would be very distracting. And, but as an actor, I just can't imagine somebody sitting there on stage just looking and reacting to you. Maybe if it was a comedy, but, a tragedy or, something that was very serious, it might be really hard to have somebody there and like sneeze right next to you on stage or something when the show was going on. Okay. Oh, here's a little bit more about Tartuffe. So the play is about someone who's a hypocrite. Tartuffe is pretending to be a holy man, but is really selfish and is tricking the man of the house, Orgon. I said Oberon, I meant Orgon, into giving him everything, literally everything. The Company of Holy Sacraments was a group around that time whose purpose it was to improve morals by acting like a spiritual police who spied on the private lives of others. This is something that was really happening. So when Tartuffe was performed at court in 1664, this spiritual police, the Company of Holy Sacraments, they took it as a personal attack, and King Louis XIV forbade any further performances. So they performed it one time at court. Then the king went out of town. So Moliere tried to perform it again when the king was out of town in 1667, but it was banned again. And this time, the Archbishop of Paris threatened to excommunicate anyone who recited or performed the play in public or in private. It was like, don't you dare, this horrible, horrible play, you will be excommunicated from the church. And being part of the church was a big deal then. Everybody was a part of the church. So if you were excommunicated, you had nowhere to go on Sunday while everybody else was going to church. Okay, and everybody knew that you weren't there. So by 1669, the opposition was gone, and basically it's been performed ever since. Okay, in Tartuffe, who does Orgon pledge to marry Tartuffe? Tartuffe, my math is all going crazy. His daughter, Marianne. So Marianne, he tells Tartuffe, yes, you can marry Marianne, even though Marianne is engaged to somebody else. What else does Orgon do to prove to Tartuffe that he trusts him? He signs over all of his property to Tartuffe. Sure, of course, you can have the deed to my house and all my property. What happens at the end of Tartuffe? The officers arrest Tartuffe as a notorious criminal and give it all back to Orgon. What is the deus ex machina in Tartuffe? Well, Orgon has signed away all his possessions, and it just happens that the authorities come to arrest Tartuffe in the nick of time. And then who was the character of Tartuffe written for? And what did he look like? And why is this important? It was written for Ducrossi. Okay, he was one of the actors in Moliere's troupe. He was a large man with a ruddy complexion. And it's important because all of the jokes about scourges and fasting are ludicrous. So he talks about the fact that, oh, he beats himself all the time. And he's like a really big, robust, heavy dude. And he's like, I'm fasting, which means that he didn't eat. Oh, I'm starving. Oh, I haven't eaten in days. And it's really kind of ludicrous because he's just big as a house. So what type of actor played the role of Madame Purnell and why? Madame Purnell is supposed to be Orgon's mother. So, the grandmother of Marianne. And it was usually played by a man. And it was made to look ridiculous. Kind of the way in Hairspray, the role of Tracy's mom is also usually played by a man. So it's made to be funny. Why was Moliere denied a Christian burial at first? He actually had two burials. So when he died, he was an actor, and the king didn't, the church was so opposed to the fact that he was an actor, the fact that he ran this theater troupe, the fact that he wrote Tartuffe, that they denied him a Christian burial. So he had to be buried somewhere else, not in the church lot, which was considered hallowed ground. But his wife at the time went and begged the king to let him be buried in the holy ground. And so they dug him up and brought him back over. And then he was given a very minimal burial, very low key, but it was in consecrated ground. It was thought that if you weren't buried in consecrated ground, you couldn't go to heaven. So that's why it was a big deal at the time. A French scene. So if you're reading the play of Tartuffe, it does not list scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4. Any of the French plays don't list scenes. A French scene is when anybody either exits or enters. So there's two people on stage talking, and that's a scene, and one person enters, and it's going to change the conversation. So now there are three people on stage. So that's a new scene. That's a French scene. And then if somebody leaves the stage again, then there's just these two people left, and that's a new scene. So anytime anyone enters or exits the stage, it's considered a new scene, and that's a French scene. And then what kind of characters were used in Restoration comedy? There was the fop. And if you don't know what a fop is a very effeminate kind of a man. They weren't gay, but they were, they had a lot of feminine qualities and were usually considered kind of a wimp. They dressed really well, and but they didn't want to do anything dirty. And so again, very effeminate qualities for a man, and it was called a fop. There's the old man who marries a young wife. That's kind of a stock character that's used. Then there's the old woman who's always trying to appear younger than what she really is and trying to, go out with a younger man who's all like, no, grandma. There's the pretender at wit and sophistication. So much like in Commedia dell'arte, there's the person that pretends that they are just socially wonderful and acceptable, but they're doing everything wrong. And again, these are comedies, so it's supposed to be funny. And then there's the self-deceived, someone who thinks that they are just wonderful and beautiful because they talk about themselves all the time, but they're not really. Ta-da! That is the end of our Renaissance. So if you have any questions, as always, go ahead and contact me. Otherwise, we'll see you in the 1800s.